matched. Oh, okay. Here it is. We are recording for Making a Magi, Bias from the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. So let's get some of that precious room tone. All right, and we are live in 3, 2. Hello, everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today, yes, right, we are talking about the First Law series, and we are spotlighting a very particular character in that series, and that is Baez. Before we get into it, I think it's important to say that there are lots of spoilers ahead.
Right.
So, Dylan, if you want to give your cursory spoiler warning.
It's not just cursory. I take it very, very serious. And there will be spoilers all the way through the original First Law trilogy. That means that takes us up through Last Argument of Kings in this episode. And if you have not yet read the First Law series, then you've got two of the biggest fans maybe out there, and me and Charles, who will tell you it's a good time to check that series out, and then you can always come back here. But if you haven't read it yet, this is probably a really good time to turn this down in your headphones. You've been warned.
Yes, very well said, Dylan. You have been warned. And with that, we can finally transition into talking about Baez, first of the Magi himself, in full, from the beginning of the Blade itself, all the way through the Last Argument of Kings.
Yeah, I'm ready to do this, Charles. But do we have someone else here on the show right now?
Yes!
What? Baez,
Whoa.
is that you?
Yes!
Welcome, Baez, to the show here.
Wow.
This is great news.
The first of the Magi in the house.
First of the Magi himself. Can't wait to talk to
I
him.
am greater than Juvens.
Okay, Baez, we get it.
I am greater than Eos himself.
We'll get there, Baez. We'll get there. We can't rush.
In due time.
In due time, because there's so much awesome stuff going on with Baez that we just simply could not talk about during our buddy reads of the first two books because they were such huge spoilers. And you got to respect the spoiler warning for anyone that's reading along with the series.
You have to, and you also have to respect the great Stephen Pacey, who is an unbelievably an unbelievably talented audiobook narrator, and that's where we isolated those.
I am greater than Juvens.
Right. I would go so far as to say that Stephen Pacey is greater than Eos himself.
Whoa. I would agree, man. These are some of the best audiobooks in the game for fantasy fans, and like those lines, I'm greater than Juvens, like that was an earworm in my brain, and I just love shouting out, I am greater than Juvens.
Yeah. No, I mean, the first time I read through this, I did not read the audiobooks at all, and then since that, I think my second read was the first time that I think I might have done all audiobook on my second read, and it's an entirely different experience doing it that way because Stephen Pacey just gives such a special voice to each one of these characters, and just you'd think that it'd be impossible to breathe further life into the First Law characters than Joe Abercrombie already has done. But Pacey finds a way to add this whole extra element, and I mean, if you've read through these books and you haven't checked out the audiobooks, I cannot tell you how much I recommend listening to Stephen Pacey narrate this. But now you're stuck with me and Charles, who have way less awesome voices than does Stephen Pacey, and you're listening to us talking about Baez, the first of the Magi himself. And we've got a few discussion topics that we want to delve into, right, Charles?
That's right. So the way we're going to go through Baez through the whole trilogy under this frame of how, like, these moments where Baez has revealed his true nature, right? Like, Baez, by the end of Last Argument of Kings, has revealed himself to be almost like this callous, cold, manipulative force of nature. And we're trying to go through these moments that happened in Blade itself and Before Their Hang that kind of hint at that and reveal his true nature. And we also just want to talk about how Baez has subverted this Magi role, this mentor role throughout the First Law, because Abercrombie is deliberate in his, I'm going to say the S word again, subversion of...
Keep it clean, though, Charles.
Yeah.
Not that S word.
Not the one in fantasy that that we have to get through. So that is the goal that we have set out for us here today. And let us not delay any longer. Let us begin where we first meet Baez. We have Logan Ninefingers, the great Logan Ninefingers, meets Baez at Baez's library. And the first time we see Baez, you know, he's not what we pictured. You know, Logan meets a bunch of people who are like dressed in robes with long flowy white beards. And Logan's like, "Oh, you must be the Magi himself." And they're like, "What? No, I'm the librarian." Like Baez is outside, and you find him. He's dressed as a butcher. He's wearing the butcher's apron. He's got his sleeves rolled up, and he's covered in blood.
Right. And as you seem to be implying there, Charles, the fact that Baez starts the book or starts his appearance in the book covered in blood might be a little bit of foreshadowing that he'll end the book, or at least the series, better said, he'll end the series covered in a way more figurative blood, because he'll be responsible
he definitely
for just countless
metaphorically rolled
deaths.
his sleeves up and got blood all over his hands, big time.
Right. And I mean, it's kind of an introduction that is most similar to, I would say, Tywin of any, at least in the Game of Thrones show.
That's right, because
like,
he
that's
was
what
butchering
it reminds me the most
like
of.
a lion or a stag or something like that. And
A stag, yeah, I believe.
yeah, that was a great scene as well in the show. But yeah, it's that idea of, you know, these guys are not afraid to get their hands dirty, and it was perhaps we should have been more clued into that the first time around with Baez than maybe we were.
Yeah.
Because it's under the frame of, oh, we're meeting the wizard, you know? It's like we're meeting this all-wise, all-knowing guy. And we know from reading books like Lord of the Rings, like, you know, where the wizard is generally a nice person, a helpful person, and Logan is going to him for help, you know? So it fits all those tropes nicely, but Abercrombie has always given us these signs, even from the very first scene with Baez, that there might be something else going on with this guy.
Yeah, and Charles, we also get this moment where Logan is speaking to the spirits, and that's basically how he learns, I think, at first that Baez is looking for him. And they're like, "Oh, yeah, but watch out. Those Magi have their own purposes." And we've kind of heard that before in other fantasy novels. So, you know, if you've read a lot of fantasy, you've probably heard something like that about, I won't say which which series do or don't say that, but you've probably heard that before, and maybe you've had experiences that didn't actually play out to be a warning you should have heeded. So you can dismiss those warnings that Magi have their own purposes as, oh yeah, no, whatever. And then you start thinking back to that when you're rereading
Like,
these
that was
books,
not a
and you're
strong
like,
enough warning,
"That's-"
Spirit. You should have
Well, I mean, the spirit those spirits don't care about what's going on with people. It probably didn't really know what Baez really had intended, but just kind of knew, like, hey, this isn't just some like all loving person. There's a person who has, or person might be generous for Baez. This is a Magi who has his own intentions, and you're probably just going to play a role in those. He's not just out there to be pro-social.
That's right. And Baez is also not afraid to play certain roles himself. Because as we, in the first time,
Nice
Baez thank you very much, Baez and Logan are going to address the closed council in Adua for the first time. They make a quick pit stop to the costume department and are like, we're putting on this play. I need a barbarian outfit and I need a wizard outfit. And that's how they get dressed up to appear in front of the closed council, because Baez is like sociopathic. He knows he needs to be what they need him. Like he knows the closed council needs to see him as a wizard, and he doesn't care what they see him as long as they obey. So he's getting all dressed up. He's putting Logan in these clothes, and Logan's like, these clothes are very impractical and uncomfortable because they're, like leather jerkins with like fuzzy stuff around the edges, like a stereotypical barbarian costume. And I thought that was also a really funny telling thing from Abercrombie, where it's like, oh, put him in the wizard clothes, it's like, that's kind of the joke, like, oh, put him in the robes and like put Logan in the leather jerkin, and let's see, like, let's do a little song and dance for the public.
Right. And I've always taken it after reading a few times now, I've always taken it more as like the public is us, Charles.
Yes.
This is what Abercrombie is doing to us, the readers, is he's putting this person in a position where we see him as, oh, it's the wizard. I can easily slot them into what I expect. And this, we parallel the folks at the closed council who potentially fall for Baez's like, look, I'm the wizard.
Baez is like, this is going to be important to them, so I may as well do it. And then we're like, it was important to us too, but I guess like that's what Abercrombie's trying to tell us. He's like, is this what you want? Like, are you happy now? He's in the wizard clothes. So like a sense of humor coming through for Abercrombie as always in those moments. And then, you have the telling line where no one believes he's really Baez, and people are reluctant. No one even acknowledges that Baez might even be a person that exists. And he drops that line, like Baez drops this line, I gave them freedom, and this is the thanks I get, which is very mild for what we know Baez says in the end of Last Argument of Kings, but it's the beginning of this attitude that Baez has about human beings.
Right. Well, I've liked to say, and I've said many times on the show before, that Baez thinks of people as cattle on a good day and ants on a bad day. And he's very quickly showing these signs that he views them as like basically ungrateful creatures that Baez has given everything that they has given them everything that they have, and they have such short lifespans that if he gets tucked away in his library for what feels to him like not too long, everyone forgets about him, and it's like aggravating to him is what we get the sense of.
Right, he's expecting to be welcomed back and praised and all these things, and he's also shown it's under the guise of, oh, he has a short temper, like he's getting frustrated quickly because that's just his character quirk, but it belies this larger issue of that he's his huge superiority complex here that's beginning to show its true colors.
Yes, that's well said, Charles.
The only other thing of note in this book, really, for Baez, is that he cheats during the the blade tournament, the sword tournament, and to help Jezal win. And we get that line, never bet against the Magi, as in like, Baez is someone who's capable of cheating for his own purposes, and he doesn't, that's just like second nature to him in this moment. He's like, yeah, of course I did, and it was easy, and it was fine. Like, who cares?
Right. And we've said before that Glokta is the character that seems most aware of the kind of book that he's in.
Yeah.
Like, just his perspective
100%.
on things. And he's the only one here who actually takes note of, like, something is up with this Magi, and he definitely cheated at this tournament, and is Baez. I mean, Glokta is super suspicious of Baez basically throughout. So he's a character that maybe we should have been paying a little bit more attention to the way he sees Baez.
For sure. And I think the only thing holding Glokta back from really getting Baez's number is that he was having a hard time even believing in magic at this point.
Yes.
So he's like, it looks like something's going on, but magic's not real, so there's nothing he could be doing right now, but I'm still suspicious, and that was kind of what he was juggling, which gets us to, the House of the Maker, where, Archlector Sultan Glokta have this plot to be like, oh, if you're really Baez, open the House of the Maker, and he's like, okay.
Fine.
And so he opens it.
Well, he's like, yes!
He's like, yes! So open it. And he opens it, and Logan removes the heavy box, and Baez forms the Fellowship of the Seed. And the last telling thing for me in this is when Baez is convincing Pharaoh to come along. And I like to think remember when Gandalf convinced Bilbo to come along in The Hobbit? It's like, oh, it's a great sense of adventure, and I need someone who's stout and pure of heart. But then with Baez, he's like, you want revenge, don't you? You want to kill them all, don't you? Come with me on adventure, and I'll show you how to kill everyone you hate. And she's like, okay. So not quite the same reasoning there, but is very, very telling.
Well said, Charles. And I think the other thing that sticks out to me about these moments with Pharaoh is Pharaoh, I'd say even more than Glokta, more than anyone, has Baez's number from the
100%.
start. We think that Pharaoh has this very distorted perspective on everything, and we're not wrong for the most part there. She's got this super cynical view, and she doesn't trust anyone. But she immediately latches on to Baez as the least trustworthy of the entire group that she's with. She looks at Logan, she's like, okay, he's threatening and big and stuff, but if I had to kill anyone here, it'd be this, bald dude, because there's something about him. And I don't know, Pharaoh.
Yeah, I mean, she even gets a shot in on Baez at some point.
Oh, yes.
And breaks his nose. But yeah, you got it. This was what I appreciated more in my second read through was with Pharaoh was, she was in tune to everybody, right? And she pegged Baez right away. And I think it's more so in the second book, but for me what sticks out in The Blade itself was just this idea of Baez being like, come with me and I'll give you revenge and you can kill Khalul and all of his followers. Not the exact premise that we get in other fantasy books, which is normally a call for adventure, not so much a call for blood, which is a great distinction that Abercrombie made for Baez at the end of Blade itself.
Right, and the punch is in Blade itself, Charles. It's in Each Man Worships Himself is the chapter. So that's, Pharaoh's right at the start, literally punching Baez, which is more when you step back at the end of the first Law series and you look back and you're like, oh my God, she legit punched him. Yeah. It is wacky to consider Pharaoh's more than a person. Pharaoh's got all sorts of other stuff going on.
Because there's the whole thing where he was testing her, but not telling her what was going on and tricking her with and stuff like that about being colorblind. That was all in the first book, right? So she's getting super frustrated with all of that. She's like, this guy's scheming, and I trust him least of all, kind of, So yeah, she had his number big time.
Good on Pharaoh.
Good on Pharaoh. We should talk more. We should give Pharaoh more due, I think, in the future.
Yeah, I
she might
agree.
get one of these. Who knows? Have
One
to
of
stay
these
tuned.
characters. Yeah, stay tuned.
Stay tuned for our Pharaoh discussion. So that brings us into before they're hanged, and the Fellowship of the Seed, as we like to call it, is underway. I just realized I said it like a bunch of times. I don't think I explained it, but that's what we call that group that goes with Baez on the quest for the seed. You know, it's our play on the Fellowship of the Ring, if that wasn't obvious. Then we got Pharaoh pressing Baez for information, and the cracks are starting to show a little bit in Baez's behavior and his stories. He's getting frustrated. He's refusing to give all of his details. He's basically like, look, this is how you're going to get revenge against the Gurkish. Trust me. And Pharaoh went on this whole thing about trust. Is like, trust is only a word that dishonest people need to use. You know, I think that's kind of around these times.
Right.
And, you know, that was a rule that came in handy for her 100% of the time in this series. Basically,
in an Abercrombie book.
Yeah.
Again, that cynical view, it tends to be a little more accurate than maybe it is in real life. And I think it's the other thing I was just thinking about, Charles. I know this is going back a little bit, but Baez just blows people up. Like, just makes people
true.
Explode. And I guess, like, when we're thinking about, I've maybe lamented in the past, I think I did in our Wheel of Time episode, I lamented the fact that Gandalf basically, like, doesn't ever do anything with his power. Like, he does, and I'm sorry if I'm
he does some important stuff.
Yeah.
but I get what you're saying.
You get what I'm saying.
He's not as proactive as he could potentially be with someone who was that powerful.
Right. Like, he's not like launching like thunderbolts and fireballs and things like that as they're going through their day-to-day questing in the Lord of the Rings.
Right.
But Baez will just go around like someone is getting his way and he needs to send a message. He's like, I'll just explode this person. And I don't know, somehow the
imagery of that's great too, right?
Because
he was frustrated that they interrupted his bath. And he like got out of the bath. He's like still all sudsy. And describing his body, it's so fun. Abercrombie's description of this scene is so great, where like all this action is going on, and Baez just in the threshold, and he's like, "What is this?" And then he just turns someone into a mist of blood, and it like horrifies Jezal for all of eternity. It's basically what keeps Jezal in line through the whole next book, is that whenever he's thinking like, why am I listening to this guy, he'll get PTSD from this moment when this dude just exploded into a bloody mist, and then he's like, oh yeah, I'm actually terrified of this guy. I forgot.
It's interesting. I've always been interested by the way that Baez chooses to control the different people in the book. Like, he has this very masterminded way of controlling Glokta, where he's like, I'm gonna let you in to understand everything behind the scenes, because if you have the capability to understand everything I'm doing, and I'm going to reveal it so you know not to mess with me. And at just a sincerely deep level. And he also, I mean, we'll get to this, but he enjoys letting Glokta in on it, because he's like, this guy can appreciate the things I've been doing. Yeah. But then with Jezal, the way he controls Jezal is at this very base level of like, I will cause you pain.
Oh yeah,
like, you've seen me cause other people pain. I will
like
cause
cattle
you pain.
On a good day. He basically sees Jezal as cattle, and he doesn't have an independent thought in his body. It's just like, you got to just keep pulling him along by the reins. Got to keep lecturing him. He'll, like, you know, he doesn't need to know why, because it doesn't matter if he understands or not. I just need him to do it, you know? Like, I'll just start talking. He'll pick it up, you know? And when I'm ready, I'll put him into the spotlight, you know? It's so funny how he does that. And he's like, oh, Jezal, you're coming with us on this quest. Don't worry about it. I've arranged the whole thing. And Jezal's like, okay.
And Jezal, I mean, when he's out of line, it's the way to deal with it for Baez is like, oh, just make his stomach hurt preposterously much until he's like, I don't want my stomach to ever hurt again. And that's like what keeps Jezal under Baez's thumb, is just like this fear of the very base pain, like superficial level pain. I don't think he grasps everything Baez is doing behind the scenes here in this Making a Magi. Did we say the name of the episode?
We
explain the Just like I'm making a
I
murder.
think we're getting there, but yeah, making a magi, right? It's this idea that it's a play on making a murderer, okay? Where we're just trying to figure out like how did this reveal that Baez is who he is slowly kind of play out across the whole trilogy here. And in these moments in the Fellowship of the Seed, the way he interacts with everyone individually is like very manipulative, very telling. And the fact that, at the end of Blade itself, when his bath got interrupted, and that's what frustrated him and caused this person to explode. He's proven to be a very petty guy and have a pretty big anger issue. So it's like, oh, you're getting in the middle of my plans and my bath time. Bye-bye. Enjoy being a bloody mist. So very, very telling there. We have Baez lecturing Jezal. We talked all about that. What we don't understand in these moments, because we don't know Baez's true plans, he is lecturing Jezal to like take the throne. Like this has been the long plan for Baez of like, oh, this is just one of those seeds that's taken fruit for me, and I'm just going to keep watering it, and like eventually I'll be ready to cultivate it, so for Baez.
Nailed it, Charles, with the seed drop.
Thank you. You like that?
Yeah.
That's just the kind of quality content you can expect on Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast at the FTF Podcast 1 on Twitter.
You probably can't expect anything that Charles says to show up on the FTF Podcast 1 on Twitter, because it's almost definitely going to be me.
Yeah, but it's the same caliber of content.
Oh, there. Charles. Calling me the same caliber as you. I know that's a high compliment from you.
Yeah. We know who's pulling the strings here.
People like to watch the pretty puppets. So.
That's right. And Jezal's just one of those pretty puppets. And that was a great reveal in book 3 that Baez has been prepping Jezal and like through force alone has concocted this whole scheme, and it's all kind of starting here with Baez giving these lectures. Yes. As the story continues, Baez uses his powers to just kill lots of people, and it's kind of telling in his reckless use of like touching the other side and using magic. Like he wasn't afraid to just like when he got annoyed, and that's the key thing here. He was getting angry when all those riders were attacking, and he just loses control and sends everyone flying and kills a bunch of people, and it leaves him unconscious. And, Kwai explains that using the art is always a risk, and Baez just recklessly took that risk, which is again telling for how Baez sees using magic as a means to an end in the future.
Yes. And speaking of means to ends, we've got on the Jezal topic, something that I wanted to bring up is there's this moment that Baez sees Jezal's new wounded face, and he just says to him, yes, all in all, I think it will serve. That's in Before They're Hanged, too. And that's this moment, and, we're in Jezal's perspective, which is right where Abercrombie goes when he needs someone to be completely clueless about things. And Jezal's just like, what? Like, what is he talking about? But it's this very clear hint that, like, when Baez is looking at Jezal's wounds as a member of his Fellowship of the Seed, he's not thinking about like, oh, is this person okay? How did this affect them psychologically? He's like, oh, well, I think I can still market this person as a king. They'll just have to be a little bit more of like this warrior king image. So he's like, yeah, I think it'll do. No worries.
Right, exactly. He's kind of looking at his prized cow. It's like, oh, can I still bring this to market? Like, what's the story here? And he's like, yes, I still think I can. And that's something he's never shown kind of any kind of regard for human life at any point.
No.
And you figure out to the extent he doesn't care later on. But what was also interesting in Before They're Hanged is we do start to like put pressure on Baez to tell the real story of Khanil and all of that. People are like, this stuff doesn't add up. What's the real story? And Baez
You mean Ptolemy?
oh yeah, Ptolemy. Hello, because there's Khanil and Zacharias who are
Mhm.
both talking at different points, are talking with Baez, and they're like, we can join forces, we can do all these other things, and Baez is like, no, I've got a plan. And then they're also like, no one really knows what happens knew what happened back then, and he's like, I knew what happened, I was there, and it was fine. So let's just keep, do you have what I need or not, is basically how Baez's conversations went with both of them. They're just tools.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically how he views everyone. I mean, the Ptolemy thing is interesting, Charles. I think that it's this one thing that we hold on to that humanizes Baez, because
Yes.
we can tell that he is very secretive about Ptolemy, but we perceive it as he's secretive about it because he's like embarrassed that he, the first of the Magi, was so in love with someone and he failed,
Right.
and it went awry, and it's kind of pieced out to us across this time, and we do get, I think, the full like Baez narrative of the story in Before They're Hanged, which
Right.
is a
And
very
it's
different
done
one from
so
the reality.
well because it's all under the context of Logan being like, we need to become friendly if we're going
Yeah.
to survive. And so Baez is telling these stories at the campfire. He's showing some like vulnerability for the
Yes.
first time by talking about Ptolemy. And it's the whole thing's very likely a fabrication to get people off his back.
Key details of it are altered, such as Canadius killing his own daughter instead of Baez killing both of them. And
Baez even being in love with her in the first place, up for debate.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know which one would make it worse, Charles, if he was in love with her and was still willing to kill her because it fit his plans, or if he was never in love with her in the first place. I guess maybe the former, but all of it is this just horrible Machiavellianism. We've mentioned that word before on the podcast, but I think that Baez is the king of Machiavellianism, of any first of the Machiavellianists, if we will.
As long as it suits himself.
Right. So it's unbelievable. The Ptolemy thing is so interesting, how Abercrombie makes us think he's being secretive and makes us think then he's being vulnerable and revealing stuff, when the whole thing is just part of his greater narrative. And I mean, that's how he's able to pull the rug out from under us so much, when kind of like the last straw for any humanity in Baez is when it's revealed later on in the last Argument of Kings that he not only did he not like try to save her, he literally killed her. And terrible.
Right. And it's such an amazing reveal, and it's still only like hinted at, and we're all the way done with Before They're Hanged, but Baez discovers that the seed was a trick by Canadius to keep the power for himself, and Baez gets really mad and declares the journey a failure, which is a whole conversation in its own right that we might have in the not too distant future. Another teaser.
Charles,
Yeah.
can I drop my Corneille quote that you know I
Yes.
love? So
Please
when
do.
they meet up with Corneille, who's one of the other Magi, and we know that she has all of these understandings at a deeper level than most of the characters we meet of who Baez is, she's referring to now like the time of Juvens, who was basically the Gandalf figure from what we can gather of the world, and Canadius is over. Canadius is the Master Maker. And then they're dead, and we're on to this kind of feud between Khalul, who is kind of doing the Baez thing, but for the Gurkish instead of the Union. And Khalul is feuding with Baez. And Corneille describes them as smaller men in a bigger world, but with no less hatred and no more mercy. And I think that is another moment that somehow we overlook. Like we're being told by this character who obviously
Yes.
knows a lot more about Baez, but I think we kind of overlook it because it's roped into this whole like Cornel is placed as this like spurned lover of both
Yeah, and
Khalul
she's a bit
and
eccentric,
Baez.
off on the edge of
Yeah.
the world, eating like weird old rotted food in a dusty house. Like
Mhm.
she's painted as being someone who may not be all together there, kind of. Was kind of
Right.
how I got it. I was like, oh, she's so far off on the edges of the world that maybe what she's even saying could be in that, like scorned lover eccentric category. But she knows more than anybody, and she's smart enough to be on the edge of the world away from them.
Yes,
It's
as far
the
away as
reality
possible from all of them.
that was such a true statement. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves for this episode is Baez worse than Khalul? Because Baez this whole time is pushing this narrative that Khalul is bad and the Gurkish are bad, and they eat people and they break the second law, and they do all these horrible things. Look how evil they are. And it's revealed to be insanely hypocritical of Baez to do all that stuff, but he's pushing that narrative because that's what he needs people to believe to work on his side. And you kind of see that in the second book where he's like, we need to stop Khalul. They're marching on the Union. How could they? They're so horrible. They eat people. They break the second law of magic, and they're just horrible. And it's just to fit his narrative. He doesn't believe any of that. And we have some great quotes that kind of go into that as we get through Last Argument of Kings.
Right. And I mean, on this topic, I guess, are we going to flesh out the whole, like, is Baez worse than Khalul more later, Charles? Is that the
I
game
think
plan,
when we get through Last Argument of Kings and reveal some of these moments in which he really shows his true colors, then you can ask the question, like, who's worse, or are they just the same on different sides? There's no
Gotcha.
Like that's what I'm thinking. Because a lot
So
of stuff
then-
happens in Last Argument of Kings.
Okay, then the last bit I'll talk about before they're hanged around Baez and how this magi might have been made is we get this interrogation from Glokta on an eater, and that's when they're in Dagaska.
Yes.
And the eater refers to
Oh,
Baez as liar and traitor. He killed his master. He murdered Juvens. Literally,
Yes.
that's said in Before They're Hanged. That's a
Yes.
quote. And then Glokta says, that is not the way I heard the story. And again, it's like it's delivered straightforward to us. What more can Joe Abercrombie do than tell you exactly what Baez did, which is he's a liar and traitor, and he did kill his master Juvens. And we're like, oh, like, of course, that's the narrative that
From
this
the
eater
enemy.
believes.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
And
They were
I
indoctrinated
don't
to
know.
believe
You
these
got-
lies, but it's like, well,
Yes.
like that's the interesting twist. Those lies are true, and this whole build up that the Gurkish are the enemy and Juvens is the enemy is just another one
Or
of Baez's.
Khalul.
Khalul is the enemy is just another one of Baez's many manipulative tactics. It's insane how amazingly manipulative Baez is. And some of the best examples are in the Last Argument of Kings. So right away, the story starts with Baez, like the Fellowship of the Seed is disbanded, but Baez keeps Jezal close by, and all for the sake of pulling Jezal in even more against Logan Ninefinger's advice, against Jezal's own kind of intuition to take on a leadership role in dealing with the Tanner, which was just something totally fabricated by Baez to basically fluff up Jezal's resume so that by the time they were able to vote on a new king, because of course, Jezal's being welcomed by the king, and then the king immediately right then and there drops dead very conveniently. And Jezal's elected king thanks to Baez's interruption. weaving this whole tale that he is the bastard son of the king and the rightful heir, and he's done all these heroic deeds. How could you not vote for him? And like he's giving them these opportunities, like spreading the word throughout the populace, like, oh, Giselle, like save this innocent person and stop these robbers and so like his legend is just so rapidly builds up to this huge thing where he's unanimously voted into king, which is such a fun twist.
Yeah. Exactly, Charles. And he has these moments where Giselle kind of ends up helping. I think it's a woman who's begging for change, and she's getting bullied by a guard or something like that. And Giselle ends up helping her kind of by Baez reverse psychologying him. Like, it's like, oh, yeah, well, like, are you going to do something about it? It's like that kind of bit. And this, right after he does, people are like, who is this guy? And Baez calls out to everyone. He's like, it is Giselle Den Luther, the winner of the contest. And then it's like all these moments, Baez, it's like we can take them at surface level the first time we're reading as this like, oh, like he's helping Giselle build his name. What a nice grandfatherly figure.
Right.
And now it's so clear in retrospect that all of this was just part of his giant Machiavellian plan, like it always is.
Very well said. And Giselle's clueless the whole time. Again, he's like the cattle, basically being slowly like suggested forwards, into the slaughterhouse, basically. It's like, come on, Giselle, like, come over here. Like, aren't you going to help this person out? Like, what are you going to do here? And like, okay, let me help you win the contest. All these little movements, little influences Baez has had in the background of Giselle's life have kind of paid off in this moment when Giselle is elected king, and Baez is happy because now he's got his little puppet king on the throne, which is awesome.
What could make Baez happier than that?
Nothing. And it's so funny to see as this plays out, like Baez finds Giselle's like newfound compassion to be kind of quirky and fun to an extent, and then it starts to get frustrating, and where it's like, I need you to have a little bit of that because I need people to think you're that way, but you can't actually be going against what I want to do. Like, that's the difference.
And he's been saying that actually there's a chapter where Giselle's kind of in his head thinking about Artie, I think. And the Giselle point of view of the whole thing is like, and the Magi kept just going on and blathering about Herod the Great. And what's happening during that, we're focused on Giselle and Artie and all this kind of stuff because we're invested in that. But when Baez is talking, he's basically like, you have to have the appearance of being someone who promotes this, I think is in Before They're Hanged, but you have to have the appearance of being someone who is like a champion of the people. He's like Herod the Great, I think it's Herod the Great that he was referring to, was always like had the appearance of being champion of people. And there's a moment where Giselle kind of comes out of his reverie and he's like, oh yeah, like I'm listening. You have to be a champion of the people. And Baez corrects him and says, like, no, you have to appear like you are. And it's not the focus of that chapter, but it's another thing that's
a really important distinction, especially when talking about Baez's character. It's like, you need to look like you're doing one thing and then pursue your best interests, like, in actuality. And Baez so masterfully has had those two personas, right? This is making a magi. It's like, oh, he always seems so nice. Who would have ever thought that he'd be wringing my guts out on the floor and I'm writhing in pain as he's telling me that, like, that he basically owns my life now, It's like crazy how we got there. And poor Giselle never, ever was suspicious. It took him, like, writhing on the floor in pain to, like, get the whole picture. Because Giselle's like, I am king and you cannot boss me around, Baez. I'm king. And he's like, dude, who do you think made you king? What authority do you think you have? It's such a good, great moment. And it's what makes Giselle so tragic. So where are we with good old Last Argument of Kings? I guess the Gurkish bombardment begins, right?
Mm.
Like Baez meets with Mamoon, who is speaking on behalf of Khalul, and Baez is like, they quarrel, and you realize that they're quarreling over this centuries old conflict, and this is what Baez lives for, is just his conflict with Khalul. So he's not backing down, and that becomes apparent in these moments. You really get to see how, like we were talking about, how petty Baez can really get about his conflicts with Khalul.
Yeah, and we'll get when we get to his moment where he's greater than Eos himself.
Yeah.
I think we'll flesh it out even more. But that's always struck me, and that's why that Conneal quote I love so much, because it emphasizes that Baez is ridiculously petty.
Yeah.
Like, he's this thousands or whatever year old magi that has seen so much, all these kind of things, but the things that motivate him are things that are pettier than the motivations of, I think, even just like a typical person who lives a like typical lifespan. It's like these ridiculous like rivalries. He wants to be better than Khalul for sure, but he's also like so petty that his mentor Juvens he like needs to be better than.
Yeah.
And it's all about that. And so like, yes, it's about power, but it's also about being more powerful than other people. And Juvens has been dead for like 1,000 years. So it's like, why? It's like, let it go, dude. Let it go.
But he just can't. He's been preparing for this moment for so long. And you have his fight with the Gurkish, and Baez has been plotting this way to become more powerful than Juvens, as we're building up to. And they go to the House of the Maker because they're like, we'll just get some weapons to fight the Gurkish. And so Yolway was there, and Pharaoh was there, and that's when Pharaoh discovers the seed and Ptolemy is revealed. But what sticks out to me in these moments is Baez sees the seed and is like, okay, we need to leave. And it's like, oh, look, it's Ptolemy. She was here the whole time. And he's like, yeah. Get the seed and we need to go. And then they're running out, and, Ptolemy's like, oh, you killed me. And he denies it, which is another great thing. And then poor Yolway. He's like, I'll hold him off. And Baez is like, okay, bye. And steals it.
Oh.
Which is like,
I think
he's not.
Pharaoh's like, we got to help him. And Baez says,
we've done all we can do.
I'll go back. When they're in there, Charles, he says, I'll go back for him. And he does not.
No.
It's like, that's Baez. It's just like, in the moment, it's like, literally, it would be too noble of Baez to say, like, no, we're doing all we can do. Like, he's making a sacrifice. It's literally like, the thing that will get me what I want right now is to tell Pharaoh that I'll go back for him. And that has never crossed Baez's mind as a legitimate possibility.
No, never.
It's just, that's going to get him what he wants in that immediate moment. So he says that.
And I love how it precedes Yolway being like, Baez, I'm asking you one more time. Like, what really happened with Ptolemy. And he's like, what I told you happened is what happened. It was so long ago now, it doesn't even matter. Like, let's not ask too many questions. And then Ptolemy just straight up, reveals the truth. And I just picture Baez, like, his second motive for keeping Yolway trapped in there is to tie up that loose end.
Well, yes. And I think Yolway already had some serious suspicions, but so Yolway says to Baez, like, I know it's been a really long time, but I seem to remember that it was the Master Maker who fell off first. Like, I was looking at you from down below, and it was the Master Maker that hit the ground first, and then Ptolemy second. So your story about, like, the Master Maker threw his daughter down, and then I struck him down in vengeance of my beloved.
Fury.
It's like, it's like, well, that's not the order of operations I was seeing here, Baez. But that's the interesting thing I always thought about Yolway, is like, he kind of does trust Baez as the like first of Magi,
Right.
and doesn't believe his own eyes, and that's his downfall.
Right, he was
is
willing to
anytime you trust
believe
Baez.
and Baez is the first of the Magi. There's the order of these things. Like Baez has to be good.
Right.
You have Khalul eating people, which is bad,
Right.
and like that's kind of what's kept Yulwei like in league with Baez. And I think Baez always kind of had Yulwei's number in a ways where it's like, stop asking me that. It's not important. Who cares? And then now that Ptolemy makes an appearance, it's just another one of those things where it's like, oh, we did everything that we can for him, but his sacrifice won't be in vain. And he closes the door on him,
God.
which is so cold. Someone you've known for thousands
brutal.
of years.
Yeah.
And you didn't even think twice about it, which is so great. And that brings us to the Square of Marshals.
The genius of Joe Abercrombie's character.
Oh, genius. And I love, like you said, balancing out like how manipulative he is and like how like long and scheming he is and how powerful he is with how petty he is. Because it's like, of course, someone that lives for thousands of years is just going to be so obsessed with their own petty things because everything else loses meaning.
I guess but there's like the other side of it where
You'd
it's
think
like
you'd let that go
it
by
could
now.
go the way of Gandalf, right? It could go the way of Gandalf where it's like you are like your own trifling like relationship stuff and that kind of nonsense is like, forget all that. I'm like, I've had all this time to self-actualize and now I'm like so pro-social. I just want to make sure the world goes well because like these things last over generations. And we like to think that as people, if we had thousands of years, we would get past all this petty nonsense. And we get to see these people like Gandalf who represent that, and maybe Juvens did too, but where Abercrombie goes a different way with Baez is like, well, even if those people did exist, even if Juvens was like Gandalf, they would be destroyed by the person to come along who is petty and is power seeking and is willing to do the thing that will destroy the more pro-social, beneficent folks like a Gandalf type.
Very well said. And, when Gandalf is using his most epic powers, he's never... He's doing it as like he's kind of like this angel figure, right? Whereas Baez, we know when we get teleported to the Square of Marshals, where he finally has the real seed, and then he prepares this whole thing where he's combining the powers of the seed and the Master Maker and Juvens to create this like intense power that's channeling basically all three schools of magic.
Yes.
And he just unleashes that on the Eaters. And even well after they're gone, he continues to unleash them in what is perhaps the greatest voiceover performance ever in the history of audiobooks, where we get this very classic line.
I am greater than Juvens.
And then the classic line.
I am greater than Eos himself.
Which is like, that to me is like the pinnacle moment of Baez being like, yes, this is what I live for, killing everybody as a way of being more powerful than Juvens.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the defining moment for Baez for me too, is because, yes, it's all about power with him. We know there's that great quote where he talks about what his first law is.
Oh, that's a great line.
Things like that.
But that comes after this moment.
So we know he cares about power. We know he seeks that. We've kind of known that to this point, but this is what defines him as that petty person for me more than anything, where it's like, dude, it's not just been about power. It's not just been about controlling the workings of the universe. It's about being this jealous small person who wants to be better than your master, who wants to be better than the people who've come before you, and wants to like prove that to everyone and show everyone and show it's like, and we get these later moments where it's like he he's basically talking to. I can't. Do you remember who he's talking to when he's basically saying like, "I combined all three.
I think
Like
it's
I'm great."
Pharaoh.
Like, okay, yeah, it's like she can't understand, and basically, Khalul. He knows that Khalul could understand, but he's like, I'm not going to be able to get the recognition from him, or maybe I'll get the recognition, but I won't be able to have the conversation where he like shows me he cares. It's like that's the stuff after thousands of years of life that Baez is obsessed with is just his own like we call Jazal a narcissist,
Yeah. Oh
and
yeah.
Baez has had thousands of years to work through his own issues around narcissism and has not gotten.
No, I think he's been canceling his appointments with his therapist.
Yeah,
He thinks
or
he's got it all
it's-
figured out for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean these moments afterwards, after he just completely annihilates the square of marshals, and he shows this callous disregard for all of the wounded on both sides, like the Union wounded and this spreading, wasting illness that he has inflicted
Oh,
through his
yeah.
magic. He fell entire buildings that people were taking shelter in, like all of these horrible, horrible things. And not to mention Pharaoh as well getting affected by the seed, which you could argue Baez probably recognized as something that could happen. Like, hey, something might go on in her brain where now she's like touched by the other side, and like she's going to be hearing voices from the other side her whole life. But I don't care. Like, I just need her to use the seed. She's a conduit in which I can use one of the three magic powers that I need to use. And that's all become so apparent in these last moments. And you're like, wow, Baez really, he caused all this devastation and like affected all of these people. He, Wes, we know, R.I.P. Wes, falling victim to this wasting illness. How many side characters died in this battle? Pharaoh getting forever kind of corrupted in some way, I guess. A bit. She's irreparably changed, and it's all just so Baez can be more powerful than Juvens. Like, that's where we're at with all of this.
Mhm.
This whole society forever changed. An age ends because Baez wanted to be more powerful than Juvens in his squabble with Khalul.
And Eos himself.
And Eos himself.
Can't forget Eos himself,
Certainly
Charles. Yeah. I mean, it's all been about these motivations to. It's basically he's got this like sibling rivalry with Khalul that is
Yes.
playing out at this just massive stage, and they're both such. I mean, I imagine Khalul. We haven't seen a lot of Khalul here, and I imagine is also probably pretty small and petty from what we've heard from Cornel. And these two are just going at each other
Yes.
in a way that if they were just normal people would be so just like, oh my God, like stop, you two are so annoying. But instead, it's like, oh, you two are causing massive scale war and death because like you can't get over this silly little
your
feud.
petty rivalry is playing out over two civilizations. It's just
Yeah.
a tool for you guys to try and one up each other, which is like the cruel joke of everyone that lives in those societies, right? Where it's like you're just the whim of a character like Baez who just wants to be more powerful than Juvens and Eos himself,
Yes.
which, brings in some, now that scene has happened, we get like, that was kind of like the rising action of the whole trilogy. And now you get these like final moments with each character.
The climax, Charles.
Yes.
I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Baez kind of gets his moment with all of these main characters, and all these main characters kind of have to be like, "What? Well, this isn't that great of an like situation," And some of my favorite lines are dropped by Baez at the end of this, and he's talking to Pharaoh, I think, and it was this idea of using the first law, and like you said, it was like against the rules of magic to break the first law. And he's like, the first law, rules are for children. This is war, and in war, the only crime is to lose, which is like,
Yes.
explains all of his behavior. He's like, I will use power from the other side through the seed, no question, because I don't want to lose my battles with Khalul. Like, that's the only law, that's the only crime. Like, I can level entire cities, I can spread this wasting disease, I can do all these horrible things, but really the only crime would be is if Khalul's eaters had killed me. Like that's like losing this battle was the only thing I couldn't do, and I'll do anything it takes to make that not happen.
Exactly. And I mean, it lends itself well, Charles, to when we flesh out more this is Baez worse than
Yes.
Khalul conversation. So I'm excited when we get there, because I think
we're
the first law and the second law, those play a very big role in that conversation. But I guess next up that we want to make sure we talk about is that interaction with Baez and Glokta. And basically Glokta just goes back to his quarters and someone's waiting for him, and he wants to know if it's Valent or Bulk, and it turns out it's both because it's Baez. And which is, by the way, that's such an epic line, I feel like, where he's like, is it Valent or Bulk I'm talking to? And Baez is like, both.
Yeah, it's like great.
Yep. Because this bank has been built up the entire trilogy as like
Look
this
to the
other
banks,
force that's
Glokta.
pulling so many strings. And it's like,
To the money lenders.
well, of yeah. And it's such a great play from Abercrombie and through Abercrombie, or through, and Abercrombie through Baez to have it be like two names.
Yeah.
Because like it's like Valent and Bulk, so you just, at least in your head, you're like, it's two people.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh no,
It's like
it's
putting
all
on
me.
the wizard costume to adjust the closed council. It's like, this is what people need to see to buy into it, and like
Right.
that's what we'll go with. You know, it's such a brilliant thing. It's like, yeah, Valent and Buck. You know, it sounds like a bank.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, I feel like banks usually, it's like someone is on, so why not? So yeah, and Baez revels in revealing just everything that he's been doing behind the scenes. I mean, it's so good. This is part of Abercrombie's great character work, is that we buy this interaction so well between Glokta and Baez, where it's like, we buy that Glokta is someone that Baez would see as possible to, like, can possibly understand everything Baez has been up to from the political machination standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And we buy at this point for sure that Baez is narcissistic enough to just go on and on and on about everything that he's done. So we actually get probably like the most natural equivalent of this like James Bond villain speech, where it's like in James Bond villains, it always feels like so forced, because like, why are you telling James Bond all of your plans right now? But for Baez, it's like, we know totally why he's telling Glokta all of his plans, because he wants to be validated. He's such
He wants
a
to
petty
brag.
person. Yes, he just wants to brag, and Glokta legit calls him out on it too, which is amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, the descriptions of those scenes are so great, because Baez is like grinning ear to ear, you know? He's just so happy with himself. Like, he's never been more content than after that whole greater than Juven's whirlwind of destruction.
Right? He's just glowing
elated.
the rest of the way.
It's so funny.
Yeah, I mean, and we get pretty much from there on, we just get left with Glokta in charge of Jezal, and then Baez from afar in charge of Glokta, and that's pretty much where we're left, right? We get these kind of moments with Glokta and Jezal where Jezal's like, like, can we try this nice thing?
I want to try democracy. And he's like, no.
Yeah.
There's no point.
Exactly.
And you know, Baez reveals the truth about his like parentage. It's like, you weren't really like, why would you think you were the bastard of a king? It's like, no, I bought you, and I bought like a million other kids like you, and you were just the one that like was rising to the top, and I chose you out of all the others I had planned just in case, you know, like it was
exactly.
You get the sense of exactly how much this is Baez's world, which not obvious at all in the beginning. He's not even a POV character. And then by the in like the last 20% of this book, you're like, this is all Baez's world. You can boil it down to Baez and Khalul and their conflict, and that's everything.
Right.
And no one else had any kind of agency over it. It's like, I just made you do what I wanted you to do. And that's kind of like this cruel joke of the first law. It's like all these characters and all their like motivations takes a backseat to the whims of Baez.
Well said, Charles. And I've heard Joe Abercrombie himself refer to, I'm going to say himself again. Joe Abercrombie referred to himself as the Baez of the First Law world. I think he referred to himself that way on Daniel Green's interview with Abercrombie. So
he probably gets enjoyment out of controlling what Baez does. It's like, I'm more powerful than Baez.
Yes, that's hilarious. So Baez, been controlling everything behind the scenes, and we get this. That moment is so interesting. Again, Abercrombie playing on our expectations of Jezal as this bastard son that gets to rise to being king, because we've seen that so much in fantasy that, oh yeah, of course, like here we go again. And then turns out that no, he's just another person that Baez set up for this as a potential path. And we get a shout out to Brint, I think.
Yeah, we do.
As another person that Baez was considering prepping for this when he was just spreading all of these kids out into the world to have a shot of being the eventual king.
Right.
And it's such a great choice by Abercrombie, I think, because Brint is like this, like, oh yeah, I remember Brint. It's like, oh, that guy? Like, what? He could have been the king
back when they were playing cards in the beginning of the first book? Yeah.
So just some random side character, and it gives you a sense of how there's probably so many folks who weren't even that prominent to register on our radar as readers that Baez could have chosen, and
he probably thinks of him just as kindly as he does of Jezal. You know, they're like,
which is not at all
kindly. Even though he went on all these adventures with Jezal and they have this history, he's not interested at all.
No, does not matter to Baez. Well, Charles, I feel like the last bit that we actually have to discuss, unless you've got more plot events you want to talk about, is this Khalul Baez bit. And I feel like, you know, the series is called the First Law series, and that's always made me feel like, looking back at it, that it's about Baez. The First Law series is about Baez and what Baez does to the idea of this first law.
Right.
And so the first law is, like, meaning the literal law in the story is, it is forbidden to touch the other side direct, forbidden to communicate with the world below, forbidden to summon demons, forbidden to open gates to hell. And then there's the second law, which is, it is forbidden to eat the flesh of men. And from the start, the way that Khalul is pitched as this awful person seems to be that he's broken the second law.
Yes.
Baez is so quick to jump to, like, look at these eaters. And of course we can jump on and say, well, that's horrible. That's disgusting that he's doing that.
Yeah, any magic that you have to resort to cannibalism to use, and like you're talking, like, that's not a hard sell as being evil. It's like, okay, they're the bad guys because they're eating people. Like, Baez is not eating people, so it's easy to see him as like the wizard on our quest, you know, versus the big bad who's raising this giant army, propping himself up as a god, or propping the emperor up as a god, and then having his most trusted people like breaking the second law. You know, they broke the law. It's horrible. How could they? You know, that's kind of the whole campaign that Baez has been on.
If nothing else, we as readers initially think, well, at least Baez isn't breaking these laws. Mm-hmm. Like, there's some sort of sense that this guy has a moral compass. And even if we're getting a little alarmed at times, we're like, at least he's got to be the lesser evil than Khalul. of course, that all comes to a head when we find out that, it starts with Baez just breaking the first law, and
Right.
he breaks it in many ways at the end, including like even just the use of the seed or considering the use of the seed. We've had these ideas that he was at least flirting with it. We've had people tell him like, "Don't get the seed. You shouldn't be doing that." And Bai's kind of like, there's some contradictions here.
But his
I don't
justification is
know
like,
if this is really
these
breaking the
guys are
first
doing
law.
something much worse. This is the only tool we have to get the job done. That's what he's telling everybody.
Yeah. And it's kind of this, I think he's criticized in some ways of like, Khalul breaks the second law, so you break the first? Like, what are you doing, Baez? And he's like, look, it's come to this, and we got to fight fire with fire. So he does break the first law, as kind of indicated he might.
Yeah.
And then what's super interesting, where maybe at that point we can justify, well, okay, Baez broke the first law, and then before that, Khalul broke the second law. Maybe even like Khalul started it by breaking the second law. So maybe Khalul is worse, we think. But the reveal later is that Baez has been breaking the second law too. He has had Sulfur be an eater for him.
Yeah.
So even possibly before, or at least like not necessarily later than Khalul, Baez had no problems breaking the second law. That was all part of his narrative about why Khalul is so awful. And then Baez went on to go the next step of breaking the first law in addition to the second law just to get ahead of Khalul.
Yeah.
And I think that's your case for how Baez might... We don't know a lot about Khalul, but that's your case for how Baez might be worse than Khalul. So he's broken 2 laws, and Khalul's only broken 1 that we know.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine Baez being better than anybody. He's either worse or just as bad. And I think an important thing was when he was justifying the use of the seed as a defense against Khalul. But that was his justification. Like, I have to because Khalul's put me in this position where I have to defend the good in the world.
Yes.
Where
he's reacting.
He's reacting. Exactly right. But again, that he's been plotting this whole thing this whole time to be more powerful than Juvens. That's his only motivating factor. We know it is revealed that Baez had nothing but contempt for Juvens. Like, Juvens had all this power and he just chose to be a nice guy.
Oh, there's a great quote.
You want to drop it?
Yeah, sure. He says, Juvens, he thought to make the world a better place with smiles and good intentions. Good intentions get you nothing, and the world does not improve without a fight. I say I killed no one. Dude.
It's like, so we've drawn the parallel of Juvens and Gandalf a whole lot, and that line really hits home of like, Baez was watching basically Gandalf, making merry with all the people in the world and using his magic for good and being a good guy and being annoyed that this is the guy that's always going to be his master, and that made Baez so angry and made Baez want to overthrow him. And that's how something happened that shouldn't. We live in this bizarro world where Juvens is dead and Baez is channeling all these different forms of magic, breaking all of these laws of magic to be more powerful than Eos himself even, which hard to imagine that Khalul's doing anything worse. My theory, again, we don't know anything about Khalul, and I've only read these books and one of the standalones, which doesn't mention Khalul at all. My theory is that they're both equally bad. They're like the same. They're at the same level. They both understand the game that they're playing, right? It's like, we say these things and we react in these ways, but we both know that we're just trying to be the most powerful one, and whatever that takes is what we're going to do. We just need to ride the wave of cultural perception, and like how we influence others in doing that might involve weaving narratives where it's like the eaters were like, oh, Baez is a liar. He lied about Ptolemy. It's like, that's true, and that just happened to conveniently fit with, Khalul. Thank you, Khalul's agenda. So I think the two of them are just equally bad, and that's kind of the cruel joke of the first law. There is no like good and evil. It's just two bickering petty people with too much power.
Yeah. Yep. I will say that it's I think it's probably best stated what you said before when you were saying that it's hard to imagine anyone worse than Baez.
Yeah.
And our case is that at the very least, it's likely that Khalul is equal of badness with Baez, and maybe he's better because from what we can gather, he's not broken the first law, at least to this point.
That's
Those
true.
kind of
If you
things.
think, I mean, if breaking the first law or not gives you morality points, I suppose he does eat people.
Baez wouldn't mind doing. He hasn't, but as far as we know,
yeah, like
I'm sure he wouldn't mind.
I wouldn't doubt. I don't think he'd look twice if it was the means to an end that he wanted.
Right.
There's another great line from the Book of Baez here. All of his isms, his philosophy. People like to watch the pretty puppet superior. Even a glimpse of the puppet can be most upsetting for them. Why, they might even suddenly notice the strings around their own wrists. It's like, this is the mind of the guy we've been with since book one. This is how he views people. Cattle, puppets, he's pulling all the strings, so to say. And it's just like the biggest reveal of this whole book is the nature of this whole book, which is it's the whims of Baez. Crazy.
The whims of Baez. Charles, I was thinking when you were talking about before that this idea of a short story of like young Baez perspective looking on at the actions of Juvens would be so interesting. Like, I just want to get that perspective. It's not something that is in Sharp Ends, but it feels like the kind of thing that would be a story in Sharp Ends, which is that's the short story collection.
Is there a Baez story in there? A POV Baez?
No, there's no POV Baez. I don't know. Well, I don't want to say what does or doesn't come, but I'll say in Sharp Ends there is no Baez POV, but it would be beautiful. We do get POVs from interesting folks that we don't get otherwise. There is I don't think it's a spoiler to just say how one of the stories starts, like whose POV it is.
I don't think that's
we get a Bethod POV, which is interesting.
That is interesting.
We actually get a Ruse POV of young Glokta. Like, we get to see young Glokta when he was Colonel Glokta through the eyes of Salem Ruse as a soldier in the army. It's very interesting. West is in that one too. So it's like, I don't know, we get some of these different perspectives of the world at different time points, and I just feel like, I don't know, I wonder if Abercrombie... I get this sense that Abercrombie would be hestant to ever give a Baez POV because the whole, like, then you're going to get a glimpse of the puppeteer, Charles.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
You
we don't want that.
Yeah, because I feel like information about Baez is so valuable because it's so critical to this entire, like, multi-book thing that he's building, where you got to keep those cards a little bit closer to the vest, I think.
Well said, Charles. But I feel like we've pretty much laid all our cards out on the table when it comes to Baez here, because I mean, we're getting close to like an hour and 20 minutes now, Charles over here, and I know we were like, maybe we can keep under an hour, but there's just so much to say that's awesome about
you can't get us started
Baez.
with First Law. We'll
characters.
Never stop. And there's so much complexity going on with Baez, and Baez has such a complex interaction with almost every character in the series that's like, to get to it from start to finish is a big task.
And once you've got a task to do, Charles, better do it than live with the fear of it, and I feel we've done it.
I would agree. I feel like we have done it as well. I don't think there's anything left to do but play that sweet, sweet outro music.
Play that sweet, sweet outro music, Charles.
All right, everybody, thank you for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. This has been your co-hosts, Charles and Dylan. If you like what you heard today and you you want to support the show, we'd love for some interaction over on Twitter. That's at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. We are also on Instagram and Facebook at the FTF Podcast. You can always shoot us an email as well. Get in touch with us directly at theftfpodcast@gmail.com.
Touch the other side direct.
That's right. And that's a law you can break anytime. And what else we got going on? Yeah, so if you're listening and you want to support the show and you just happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, Dylan, what kind of option do they have before that?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Right.
All you have to do is find our podcast on Apple Podcast app and scroll down until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, we would love if you clicked 5 of them. If you do have a little extra time, then writing a review is super duper helpful for a podcast like ours. But just listening, y'all, that is more than enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for listening. We greatly appreciate it. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.